Okay, now we're back on track. Good morning. So we're doing a series within a series for those who haven't been here. Our bigger theme for this year is revival. The theme within that, and obviously 2020 is a really bizarre year to be talking about revival. So we didn't plan for 2020 to blow up whenever I picked this theme for the year. But I think it's really fitting, right? We're all struggling. We're all looking around. We're seeing people getting sick. People are dying. People are losing their jobs. People are protesting. People are rioting. Tensions are flaring. There's all kinds of bizarre stuff going on around the world. And last week we talked about what the devil wants us to see versus what's actually happening in the world. And statistics are really important. And this theme, within the theme of revival, I think is vital. Navigating the church during COVID. A lot of people right now, a lot of Christians don't really know what the future holds. A lot of churches are banned from meeting in person. A lot of churches had to grapple with this whole online thing. Fortunately, we've been online since September of last year. So when this hit, we were already online, we were live, but we had to really tighten things up and work through a lot of technology issues. The face of the church is changing constantly. So how do we navigate the church during COVID? And I want to talk about today the Gospel of Mark, and Mark is also known as, kind of nicknamed as the Gospel of Immediately. If you read the blog post that I wrote for this week, I always write a blog post on the website that has to do directly with the sermon that's coming up on Sunday. Mark is nicknamed the Gospel of Immediately. Of the 40-something times that the word immediately is used in the New Testament, something like 90% of those occurrences are in the short Gospel of Mark. Mark is only 16 chapters, and Mark uses it in rapid succession. And there's a purpose for that. We're going to talk about that today. But first, I wrote about this in the article. We are so accustomed to Christianese, right? We have our language of Christianese, and I'm going to give you just a few examples of this just as an illustration, and I think you all understand what I'm talking about. A sin is a sin. We've heard that a lot, right? In context, what that means is something has been brought to my attention and I don't want to confront it. So we just equalize sin and be like, well, we're all sinners. A sin is a sin means I don't want to deal with this right now. This is one of my favorites. Lord willing. Have you ever used that? Hey, we hope to see you there at the church picnic. Lord willing. Translation, I won't be there. This is another one of my favorites. It's not my calling. Translation, I don't want to hurt your feelings when you ask me to teach Bible class for this semester or this quarter. It's really not my calling. And another one, and this is directly related to the sermon. There are so many of these, but this is directly related to the sermon today. In God's time. Right? In God's time. Well, do you really want to dig in and do you really want to serve your community in God's time? Right? What that means is, I'm really good at procrastinating, I just don't want to admit it. So we say that, we use that, we cliche these Christianese statements. We put them out there, in God's time. So the question is, what is God's time? And I don't want to minimize the fact that sometimes God does have this really bizarre timetable. And while that's true, that things will happen in God's time, there's another aspect to that as Christians, and especially in Western culture, where everything is so rushed, when it comes to Christianity, we're usually the opposite of how we are culturally. So when it comes to this sense of urgency within the church, usually we're the opposite of how we are at work, right? When we get to work, it's like, boom, alarm goes off, rub your eyes, jump in the shower, hurry up, rush, 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 get ready, get kids ready, walk out the door, skid sideways into the parking lot, leaving black marks across the pavement, jump out of your car, open the front door, and you pull a Sonic and roll into the building and clock in, and you just made it just in the nick of time, right? We live that way, and we feel the anxiety of that rushing all the time. But in the church, usually that goes away, and we say, well, in God's time, in His timing. I was watching a video completely unrelated to this. It just came up on my time feed, and Natalie will tell you, my poor boys have inherited my brain. I get distracted by everything. So I see articles that come up or videos, and I'm like, oh, that looks interesting, right? And I gotta watch. So this one was this girl who's 12 years old, and she's a millionaire. And my kids are little mini entrepreneurs, and they're amazing. And so I watched the first couple of minutes. It was a podcast with this 12-year-old girl who was on Shark Tank, and she turned down a $30 million deal. She turned it down because she can make more money. One of the Shark Tank guys wanted to buy like 70% of her business. She would get 70%, or he would get 70%, and she would get 30%. She turned down a $30 million deal. 12 years old. What was interesting is what she said about this, and it just caught my attention because of the theme for today, because what is God's time in the Gospel of Mark? God's time is immediately, and we're going to see that throughout Mark. But here's what she said. Her name is Hanali Swan. She got her name because her parents visited Hanali, Hawaii, and they liked that name, so they just named her after the town. But Hanali Swan, she's right now 12 years old. She said, you know, people always ask kids, what do you want to be? What's the rest of that statement? When you grow up. How many of us adults are still saying, I wonder what I'm going to be when I grow up? Right? My wife and I have this conversation. We wonder what we want to be when we grow up. She said, my parents asked me the most important question when I was 7 years old. They said, what do you want to be right now? And she said, I thought about it for a minute. She was like, I want $20. Can you give me $20? I want to make a hand-stitched, handmade keychain, and I need to buy the materials. That's what I want to be right now. And they said, okay. They give her $20, and she made a keychain, hand-stitched it. She made, I think she said food. She was just making, like, shapes of food. And she sold her first keychains, and she reinvested and bought more materials and started making more. She handmade all of it. And eventually that changed, and she started painting things, and somebody looked at that, and they were like, your paintings are beautiful, but you should turn that into something a little more practical that inspires people. So she started a clothing line and is now a multi-millionaire at the age of 12. And I thought, isn't that an interesting question? Because we're so accustomed, and we don't even know it, we're so accustomed to failure. We use that language constantly in the church. In God's time, if it's God's will, when we're praying for people, Lord, please heal this person, and we throw that in there, if it's your will. Well, of course it's His will. But I think sometimes we're praying that because we're not really sure, because we're so accustomed to failure. Google this. Look it up. Teaching kids to fail. I just Googled that this morning. Teaching kids to fail. And you would think that all this stuff would come up that's negative, saying like, hey, we teach our kids to fail. You know what the articles were that came up? The importance of teaching your kids to fail. Article after article after article. It's so important to teach your kids to fail. That's a good life lesson. Teach them young. Teach them how to fail. And I thought that's interesting because I understand what they're trying to say. It's okay to allow your kids to experience failure, But there's a difference between allowing your kids to experience failure and teaching your kids to fail. And these articles are saying you need to teach your kids to fail. The way that we do testing, I don't know about you, but the way that I learn is if I make mistakes, I feel bad about that already, but I learn by people saying, hey, I really like what you said about this, or I really like what you did with this. That's how I learn. That's what motivates me. That's what puts me into gear. In our education system, if you think about it, what's all over our kids' paperwork from the time they're this big? What is it? What color? We even highlight the color, right? Red. We circle the mistakes. And I remember getting tests back and just feeling so defeated. Even though they were good grades, you just look at that and you feel defeated because you see red all over your test. And it's like all the blemishes, all the problems, all the mistakes are circled. Not that we should give trophies for everything. It's not what I'm arguing. But think about this. We're so accustomed to highlighting the things that are wrong. Standardized testing. This girl, Hanali Swan, talked about it. She dropped out of school in the 5th grade. She's like, it's funny, people have on their resumes on Facebook all these accomplishments they did. She's like, what do I have on my resume? She's like, elementary school dropout. But she talked about standardized testing and how we don't teach kids individualistically. We don't teach them and nurture their individual gifts and talents. She said we just kind of lump them all together and teach them as a herd. Language, the language can't, don't. You can't do that. There's no way. It's impossible. We hear that all the time. We teach our kids that you got to go to 6 years of college. You have to bury yourself in $100,000 to $200,000 in debt before you can amount to anything. If you don't go to college, if you don't get this education, you'll never get a job. You'll never be able to support your family. We teach this stuff. And that bleeds over into our Christianity, into our church culture. If you don't believe me, listen to the language that we use. Now you're going to be aware of that, and you're going to start hearing that stuff. But here's what happens in the Gospel of Mark, and I've noticed this with Mark using the word immediately over and over and over again. Mark is highlighting, one, that needs are immediate. That Jesus' response is immediate. That God's intervention is immediate. And that people serving one another is, you guessed it, immediate. So I'm going to go back and reread the scripture that Victor read, and then I'm going to just highlight, I just started underlining the words immediately in the Gospel of Mark, and I'm just going to read some of those kind of in rapid succession. But first I'll start with this scripture. Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. Right? Jesus wasn't like, I got to go, I got to go to rabbinic school. I got to get my education. I got to make sure that these people are it's the proper time, the proper season. He didn't do that. He just walked in, right? He sees a synagogue, boom, walks in. Starts preaching, starts teaching. Verse 22, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. That's kind of an interesting scene that Mark paints because, right, he's showing that the focus is on Jesus. Jesus is teaching. People are enthralled with that. They're amazed at his teaching. But immediately they notice, here's this man with his unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. I would have loved to be at that church service, by the way.
And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once, I think the translators at some point just got tired of writing immediately, because it gets awkward after a time. This is the same word in the Greek language. Mark is using the same word over and over. The translators say at once instead of immediately, but it's the same word. And immediately, his fame spread everywhere throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Do we ever hesitate as Christians? Do we ever wonder, like, hey, we've been going at this for 35 years. I've been at this church for 72 years, and we ain't changing a thing, kind of thing, right? Sometimes we get stuck in that rut. And in the back of our mind, if we're not saying it out loud, in the back of our mind, we're like, well, in God's time, he'll take this church and he'll really shape it. And it cripples us. It's still one of the most riveting things that I've heard, and I'm not saying this because she's my sister and I'm biased. I'm saying it because of the impact that it's had on me. My sister Stephanie, when she was here a few years ago, her and Ronnie were putting on a presentation about their work in Haiti. And she said, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that, one, we're not going to be able to save the world. That there are going to be people who die on our watch. We're not going to be able to serve everybody. We just can't. We're human. And so the most important thing that we can do and that we should be doing right now is serving the person who's sitting across the table from us. To find the person who's in need and to serve them right now. That's always stuck with me. That's made a big impact on my life. So I'm going to read some of these scriptures because it's so cool. It's so powerful. Okay, Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 9. In those days, Jesus came up from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Jesus is coming up out of the water. Immediately the heavens tear open and the Holy Spirit comes down. In God's time. Verse 12, the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Verse 16, chapter 1. Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." These are people whose business was to catch fish and to sell it. And we learned from last week, their business wasn't booming. It's not like they had this vibrant business and they're just rolling in their beds in this pile of money. They were struggling fishermen, and listen to the next verse, 18. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Verse 19, and going a little further, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. Verse 20, and immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. Can you imagine? Right? We come up with every excuse in the book to not serve. Well, I'm busy. I got a lot going on. In God's time, right? We use that a lot. These guys left everything immediately and followed Jesus. Well, where did they get that example from? How about Jesus himself? Jesus didn't let grass grow under his feet. Neither did his disciples. We just read the text in verses 21 through 28, jumping down to verse 29. And immediately he left the synagogue. That's after he healed this guy. Immediately he left the synagogue. I know what my wife is thinking right now. Right? I stand around and talk for a long time. Jesus, immediately, he leaves the synagogue. He's not standing around. He's not making small talk with people. He's not hanging around. He's not building relationships. Immediately, he left the synagogue. And he enters the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. Do you see the sense of urgency? Jesus, she's sick. What does he do? Verse 31, he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. She wasn't letting grass grow under her feet either. Skipping to chapter 2. I could go on. I could do this throughout the entire Gospel of Mark. I'm just going to read a couple of these. Chapter 2, Jesus heals this paralytic. They lower him through the roof. Jesus tells them, verse 5, Jesus saw their faith. He said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Verse 6, now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they were thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts?" Skipping down to verse 12 or 11. Jesus said, "I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home." And he rose and immediately picked up his bed and went out before all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." Chapter 3. There's this man with a withered hand in the synagogue, another healing in the synagogue service. Jesus is constantly disrupting the service, so to speak. He heals this man in the middle of the synagogue service. Verse 5, he looked around at them with anger. That's Jesus. He looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. See, Mark is building this big contrast where Jesus, every reference to immediately, what's Jesus doing? He's responding to people who are in need. And the antagonists throughout Mark also immediately respond, and what are they doing? They're deconstructing, they're tearing down everything that Jesus was doing to build people up. In the Gospel of Mark, you have other people. Mark highlights these stories of people. Hey, first, let me go bury my dad. Hey, first, before I follow you, let me do this. Hey, before I follow you, let me take care of business. Mark's highlighting those stories to build this radical contrast between what Jesus says and does and what other people are saying and doing. And it's really incredible. So I wanted to highlight that. What do we do during this time? Do we sit and wait COVID out? Not for a second. There are so many Christians right now who are just crippled, and they're like, well, we're just going to wait and see what happens. Why? Do you have people hurting in your community? Do you have neighbors who are struggling? Do you have people that you bump into at the grocery store who are depressed, who are struggling? Do you have people every day that you bump into, that you see, who you know are struggling? Then why not immediately reach out to them, pray for them, serve them, give them money, do something to help and assist those in need? I love the Gospel of Mark. I love how to the point Mark is. I love that Mark is the Gospel of immediately, that he highlights this over and over. Go back and read it. Highlight, underline, underscore all the places where Mark says immediately, and then go back to the beginning of Mark and read it again. It's really cool that when you see what Mark is doing by highlighting this, when you go back and reread it, it's so cool. It's so cool to see what Mark is up to. I want to encourage you to go out, serve people. Don't wait. God's time is now. God will immediately show you the needs that people have. And if you immediately step in and serve them, you will immediately offer relief to them and bless them. If there's anybody this morning who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, or anybody who has any prayer needs, we would encourage you to come up, or one of our shepherds will be in the back as we all stand and sing.